Thanks for listening to FreshEd. It's rewarding to produce this show for the thousands of listeners around the world, but it takes a lot of work to make regular episodes. What sustains our effort are voluntary memberships from paying supporters. If you're enjoying FreshEd and would like to join our membership, please sign up at freshedpodcast.com. You'll also be able to sign up for our 10th anniversary celebration, which will take place online and in person on October 18th. This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brehm. Today we dive into universities and their futures. For many people, universities are in crisis. Public funding has decreased, mounting pressure to move online and offer complete flexibility to students has increased, there's job cuts, and whole courses and programs are on the chopping block. My guest, Cris Shore, helps unpack the state of universities and critically explores their futures.
Across the board, we've seen this. So staff cuts, restructuring, ridiculous, this idea that somehow, technology is going to make everything more efficient. And the result, of course, is burnout, stress, massive overload on those staff who remain because the quantity of work doesn't go away. But when you restructure and make redundant, half of a department, then the remaining half still have to carry on as before.
Cris Shore is an emeritus professor of anthropology at Goldsmiths, University of London. He's recently published a book with Susan Wright called Audit Culture: How Indicators and Rankings Are Reshaping the World. Cris Shore, welcome to FreshEd.
Thank you, Will, and a pleasure to join you.
So I'm really happy that you could come on the show today because I want to unpack the current state of higher education, particularly in the global north, which seems to be just sort of experiencing so many problems and difficulties just looking at the newspaper in either Australia or in the UK or in the US. So how would you see some of what are the current challenges that universities are facing in your experience?
I think the current period is one of unprecedented challenges for universities. I mean, we've got all the ones that we are all very familiar with. We know that there are rising costs and falling revenues and that universities are under increased pressure of competition. Students are more demanding. Their expectations are higher. And there's lots of disruptive technological innovations. But I think there's a big broader background to this that exacerbates those pressures. And the main one, of course, is the overall withdrawal of state support and funding for higher education and the reframing of universities and a university degree, not as a sort of a public good, but as a sort of a private personal investment in one's individual career. And that, in a sense, we're experiencing at the moment is really the fruit of that net shift away from seeing higher education as a public good that deserves some sort of support. And you asked about the state of the universities in the global north. I'm situated in the UK at the moment. Earlier this year, the Office for Students, a government-created body that the last Conservative government in 2010 created to promote competition and choice in higher education, it predicted that by the end of this summer, some 117 out of the 270 UK higher education institutions, UK universities, that's about 43%, will be facing severe financial difficulties, with the prospect of insolvency, default on payments, and bankruptcy.
So not a good picture, it seems like, at least in the UK. Here in Australia, there's been countless universities that have similarly been facing financial difficulties. And I think a lot of it does have to come back to the same sort of two issues that you bring up. Education, higher education in particular, as a private investment, and the withdrawal of state funding over decades, basically, has sort of brought us to this point where universities might sort of fail in a weird way.
We haven't yet seen that. I anticipate that will happen. I think that the last Conservative government in the UK was so fixated on competition and markets that it more or less anticipated that one or two universities would go into receivership. And in a sense, sense, it was looking forward to a test case where universities that went into receivership or bankruptcy would either be taken over by for-profit providers or merged into larger ones. So it wanted to push an experiment. And a former Conservative minister in the UK talked about, yes, we do foresee market exit in future of one or two institutions.
It's kind of sickening to think about. One of the things that you've been interested with this sort of development over the last few years is that these crises have precipitated a renewed focus on sort of the study of futures within higher education. Like, what is the future going to hold for universities given all of these crises? And what you sort of pull up are these reports by management consultancy firms like KPMG and PricewaterhouseCoopers that are writing about the future of higher education and articulating a particular vision for higher education. So how did these reports sort of imagine the future of higher education?
Yes, I have had a growing interest in the Big Four and the role of the audit companies and I've noticed over the last 20 years how there's been an increasing encroachment of interest and of these consultancy firms into the sphere of higher education. And I did a survey. I wrote an article recently for Public Money and Management, which was based on a kind of review of some 30 or plus reports that have been published over the last sort of 5 years, really since the beginning, just before COVID to now, looking at how they imagine the future of higher education. Because what was fascinating is how many of them have future in the title, you know, the future of higher education at a crossroads. And they all talk about the future university. And they all begin with a kind of premise that, you know, somehow universities have been rather backward looking, out of touch, that universities have somehow failed the economy. There's a kind of underlying conservative narrative about that. They're no longer sort of in tune with the needs of students or with the businesses, and that taxpayers can't go on supporting them. And the claim that we've actually entered a new era in history, one that is sort of characterized by competition, disruption, and a new ethos in which to quote one of the reports, the student consumer is king. So this whole idea that the student is the sovereign purchaser of kind of educational services. We've entered the age of the customer, and that it's quite right and legitimate that, like students and parents, governments and funders are also questioning what is the value of a degree. But part of the argument in these reports is that faced with all these sort of dangers and these heightened competition and costs, universities should set about, and I use this word kind of advisedly, it's their word, they should set about future-proofing in armouring themselves for these future shocks by restructuring, by making better use of online technologies, digitalization, more use of virtual reality, adopting one report talked about an everything, everywhere approach. And typical of all of these reports is that they propose a series of future scenarios where you imagine or picture what the landscape of higher education will look like in 10 or 20 years' time. And all of them, most of them have a sort of 4 or 5 different scenarios where we're having a much more variegated landscape composed of, at the top, you've got the elite universities, the niche universities, the ones like the Harvards and the Ivy Leagues and maybe some of the Australian, G7 or the maybe ANU and Melbourne at the top there competing, where, these ones have large endowments, can offer traditional kinds of across-the-board education. And but then below then you've got this other sort of variegated sector where you've got the entrepreneurial university, which is more attuned to business, and you've got the disruptor university, which is engaging with blue chip technologies and virtual reality, and then partnerships universities where you engage with other providers and local authorities, or even in the United States, states. And I think there's also, I've heard of the subscription university, where you buy into it as a lifelong learning mechanism. So it's from teenagerhood to old age, you can have this sort of subscription to your university courses. So yeah, these variety of different scenarios, they are key insights from these reports, though, that all of them sort of are kind of proposing actions that universities ought to take in order to promote flexibility, to be speedier, to introduce more kind of executive-led decision-making, less participatory decision-making. And they all highlight the risks and dangers of inaction. So the simple message is it's like a cry to urgent action now. The time to act is now. So they create this sense of panic, if you like. And they all use metaphors from sort of extreme weather events, like there's going to be an avalanche, there's going to be a tsunami, there's going to be a flood.
Tapping into our climate anxiety.
Yeah, it does. It evokes that, like, exactly the language of climate anxiety and extreme weather events that we can't control. We have to learn how to ride them, survive them. Resilience. It's all about resilience.
That's right, resilience. And then it's, that idea that one of the solutions or models, future models here, is like the university that's organized like Spotify is just so strange to me.
Actually, that's a brilliant comparison. Yeah, Spotify, on demand, favorite playlist, subscription.
It's wild. It's really wild. I mean, what's interesting is that the way you're talking about the future of higher education here, at least the way the reports are talking about the future of higher education here, they're not saying the public university, the university that's going to create a better public good for more people. That's sort of like not being stated.
No, what's conspicuously sort of missing in these reports, it is curious that, they're all about, the assumption is always about that universities are commercial enterprises, that the bottom line is always about money, market share, and financial solvency and competency. And what's missing in the report is there's virtually no mention of the fact that public universities have a civic mission. They perform a very different function to a business. And there's no consideration, for example, of the idea, the very concept of education for citizenship or education for personal growth. Maybe that features in the elite universities where if you can afford it, or education as equipping people for kind of critical consciousness. Two other observations I made from these reports is that, despite this constant reference to the student as the sovereign consumer, there is virtually no mention of real student needs in any of these reports. You get the feeling that they haven't actually spoken to a single student. The student is treated as this one-dimensional consumer whose only interest is in securing a good, well-paid job at the end of their degree because they want, quote, a return on investment. I get no feeling or no sense that any of these reports went out and actually spoke with any real students. They were spoken for. And the third observation, or second one, is that these reports, masquerade as serious pieces of weighty research. They do not cite, most of them do not cite any academic research. We know that there's a vast wealth of literature that is with serious scholars and researchers who have analysed university futures, have analysed student needs, and it's there's a huge, I don't know how many journals are devoted to higher education research and university futures and student well-being, but virtually none of this literature is cited, and maybe one or two I've come across actually do draw on some key literature, but most of them, no. You wonder, who are these researchers? They've outsourced it to sort of professional writers, reports, and they are produced gratis, but you do wonder, for whose benefit are these? They launch them out there and put them on the website, but they're not aimed at making an intervention or a contribution to research or scholarship.
So who are they for, right? Like, why are these, the consultancy firms, why are they interested in universities and the future of universities? Like, what, who is this audience that they're targeting here?
When I did some research, I actually managed to do some interviews with one or two of the lead authors of these. And the way they framed it is that these interventions are exercises in, and I quote, thought leadership.
What does that mean?
It means that they're attempts to influence kind of leaders in higher education. So when they mean leaders, they don't mean, university professors. They mean vice chancellors, stakeholders in the purse strings of higher education. So they're really aimed at influencing government, private sector investors and university leadership teams, really. That's who they're aimed at.
And what do they expect to get out of it? Like, is it these are consultancy firms are for-profit companies. Are they expecting to make money and profit from their connections to universities?
Yeah, initially I pondered this question because you mentioned we talked about the big four, KPMG, Ernst & Young, PwC, Deloitte, and then you've got McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group. These are big financial players. Why on earth are they targeting universities? I think the answer to that is really quite simple. It's that, partly because these firms are always looking for new markets, new opportunities, new possibilities. And they have a kind of strategy that a colleague of mine who does do research on this business sector, she described it to me as the approach is land and expand. You find a new area, you make an intervention into it, and then you use that as a colonized field to capture more and more market share. And universities, if you think about it, any university, even a relatively poor, in a qualified sense, but not a prestigious university at all, but they are holders of major assets. And according to these firms, and many of the reports have argued this, that universities are sitting on untapped, underleveraged resources. They are major assets that haven't yet, and many of the reports use this phrase as well, they have untapped potential. And so what these firms claim they're doing is they're helping university leaders release that potential. And by potential, they always mean release the possibilities of extra income by marketizing the resources. And it started out, we saw this process beginning 40 years ago with the gradual neoliberalization and marketization of higher education. You sell off lucrative university resources, catering, sports facilities, grounds, the land upon which universities sit. If it's not, held in native title, or if it's not owned by somebody, it can be, slices of it can be sold off for development and developers. But I think that there's another key phenomena here that this reflects. It's not just that, consultants and finance sector advisors and interested parties are getting interested in universities. They are actually penetrating universities. If you look at the composition of most university governing councils or governing boards, what you will notice over the last 20 years is this gradual increase in representation from people who have no experience in the public sector, but are increasingly recruited for their expertise in private finance and private management. So I believe there was a report in Australia by the National Tertiary Education Union that pointed out that over 40% of all seats on governing councils were occupied by people who who represent expertise from the financial and consulting services. So, there's obviously what we're looking at here is something very systemic. Once you start colonizing university governing boards with representatives from the finance industry, they're going to see everything through the lens of finance. And I think this explains why Vice Chancellor salaries, the eye-watering level of payment that senior executives, senior leaders are paid now. I mean, your typical Australian and UK Vice Chancellor is paid far, far more than the Prime Ministers of our country. And for what? Because they would say, I'm the CEO of an enterprise that has an annual turnover greater than most, large or medium-sized companies. And therefore, if this were a private sector company, I would be expecting this level of remuneration. And there's also, you might also say that once you've got this, universities increasingly being folded into these, kind of networks and experts from the finance sector, what you find, and this has been confirmed to me in some of the interviews, is that, university leaderships are very weak when it comes to trying to negotiate with these very astute financially savvy people who work in that financial sector. And, they don't know how to negotiate with these often very predatory experts from outside when they're negotiating loans, deals, arrangements, interventions. So they end up shelling out millions and millions of dollars in payment for these kind of market level rates for services that really they could have done in-house.
That's usually the most amazing thing is, you get these different reports done. You hire KPMG to tell you about your sustainability policy in the university. And then you have a department that is like world-renowned experts on sustainability in the university. And it's just so ironic that the university leadership isn't drawing on the expertise that it has in-house.
I think there's a really strong theoretical reason for that. And it is, we're marching in equal step with the marketization of universities was the reforms known as New Public Management, based on the theories, the doctrines of public choice theory. And one of the key doctrines there is you cannot trust employees to work in the interests of a company. So you always have to separate out the purchaser and the provider split. And you don't trust your own employees because they will, quote, always work for the benefit of their own interests. And this justifies why most university governing boards have very tiny representation from employers. And two, why, you may have a whole department of architects or business studies people who world leading experts, but no, you have to go outside and get some perhaps not even very good consultants to come and repackage what we already know and get the fee for it.
Do you see these reports that you've been looking at came out 5 years, 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer? Today, do you see any of the sort of vision that was articulated in these reports actually manifesting in universities? Like, is it actually having a material impact in universities today?
Yeah, I think it is. I think many universities, faced with these severe financial crises, what do? They're increasingly sucked into the processes around economization and financialization and marketization. I'm sorry to use all these kind of izations, but they are processes that show how universities, having been folded into this process, they're becoming more and more dependent on the expertise that consultants and finance industry experts provide to them. And as a result, they adopt the language of those institutions, and we see that, the discourse. And even, I take the university where I used to work, we had a new vice chancellor came in, was always talking about, her credentials were very much in the area of environmental sustainability. There was always talk about sustainability, but sustainability was recast as financial sustainability. And so it all became that, we used this sort of bastardized ecological metaphor were used really just to reinforce this entrepreneurial vision. So the universities follow the kind of the lead of many of these reports, and they focus on income generation. They see it as imperative to capture markets, student markets. They talk about, most universities are obsessed not only with money, but perhaps even more importantly, with reputational capital. This plays into this whole narrative of competition, so who can put on their big publicity banners? We are world leading in these disciplines. We are the number one university for, and that gives rise to these ranking industries and metrics where universities are engaged in, Hazelcorn calls it a kind of the reputational arms race. It's akin to the kind of nuclear arms race where universities are all struggling to be in the world top 50 or the top 100, but you've got thousands of universities, so they can't all be in the world top 100, but they're going to try anyway. And these consultants supposedly are providing them with the future-proofed strategies for achieving these goals.
When it comes to, say, financial sustainability here, I would imagine one of the biggest expenses that universities have are on their staff. And so is a consequence of a lot of this that we're seeing job losses like across universities. I know in Australia, it seems like every day I read about a new university that's going through a round of layoffs. My university just finished a round of layoffs. Is this a consequence of some of this thinking?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my university has just had a second, if not a third round of layoffs. Huge swathe. I mean, it was estimated that 10,000 academic jobs will be lost in the UK this year. This is by the Universities and College Union. Why? Exactly as you say, the largest expense in most universities is on staffing costs. And the trick is this. I mean, I saw this at play in my own institution, that the external consultants were brought in to review the university's expenditure and threat, with a typical SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And the threats, and what they would do is then engage in a rather spurious benchmarking exercise where they would take one university, our university, and then say, look, you're spending 68% of all of your money is being spent on staff costs. When we benchmark you and compare you with these other universities who have completely different profiles of, we see that they're only spending 58%, and therefore we need to achieve a 12% reduction or whatever. And that's how it works. So they look at where can we make largest savings, and it is to staff costs. And to achieve those costs, the second step, of course, is restructuring. And I suspect that most universities in Australia, like the UK, have gone through an absolute rash of restructuring to the point where it feels like that is the new normal, i.e. constant restructuring. And it's partly because this is the elusive quest to achieve efficiency through restructuring, because there's a sort of a business model 101 that says if you get rid of departments, and this has just happened in my own institution. I used to be head of the anthropology department at Goldsmiths College. 2 years ago, they abolished departments. The same happened in the previous institution I worked for. Departments get dissolved, disciplines get dissolved, you get merged into schools where you then become not even a discipline, but a subject area, where you're thrust together with other representatives from this sort of hybrid social science model. But the idea, the myth, is that this restructuring is going to save costs. In fact, what it does, it doesn't eliminate the work. It just means that the costs are pushed further down the line, so that academics who already had a very full-time job teaching, administering, doing their own research now have to do all this additional admin. Most universities have seen restructuring of their administration so that you strip out all local administrators. You then relocate them in sort of like call center type buildings, often that are accessible only with a swipe key. So that you sever this connection between the administration and the academics. So every time an academic needs a service, like my computer won't work, I'm just about to give a lecture, but I can't get the IT system to work, you then have to log in and make a request to call IT, call it. And, and then you get this email response saying, we endeavor to respond to your inquiry within the next 3 days, but you need the answer now. And this is supposed to save money. And across the board, we've seen this. So staff cuts, restructuring, ridiculous, this idea that somehow, technology is going to make everything more efficient. And the result, of course, is burnout, stress, massive overload on those staff who remain, because the quantity of work doesn't go away. Even when you restructure and make redundant, half of a department, then the remaining half still have to carry on as before.
Listening to you, it's quite absurd, like the picture you're painting, but it's so true. And what I was reflecting on listening was, like, sometimes when you're in that environment, it's hard to step out and get perspective on what's going on, and you just are trying to make it through each day, right? It's so unbelievably busy and hectic, and you're solving a million problems, and there's no support. And all you can do is just like, can I just get through today, and then I'll worry about tomorrow, let alone stepping back and seeing this massive picture about how degraded the university has sort of become. It's kind of depressing.
Well, I'm always an optimist, but yeah, I think, optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect, as Gramsci put it. But I think there are reasons to be pessimistic. I'm emeritus. I stepped down from full-time teaching. I'm still doing a lot of research, but a lot of my colleagues in a similar position say, I'm glad I'm not young. I'm glad I'm not starting out a new and emerging researcher. I'm very relieved I'm not having to to experience what my, people in their 30s and 40s in universities are having to go through, because it's unsustainable. Which begs the question, who is this for? Who is benefiting from massive restructuring? And I think, well, the answer is, it's part of the downgrading of the role of the academic, and universities have become a means for somebody else's ends. They're increasingly being instrumentalized, as it's hard to recognize what the university has become from when I first started out, 40 years ago, and it was a space of, collegiality, you had autonomy in what you taught. It was learning. There was solidarity. And now, it's like we're doing so many things, according to templates. Most of the time is responding to, used to be the administration were there. We used to call professional staff support staff or admin staff, but, because they're often the role was to support the teaching and the research function. Now it's the other way around. Academics are there to service the needs of the demand of the professional staff who were asking for data on this and so forth. It's not many universities have been described as sort of factories of sadness at the moment, because they are not happy places to work in. My experience when I do scan the survey, and I've done lots of interviews and I've done lots of research on, particularly on universities that have been going through major restructuring. And the thing I can say for all of those is that they become low trust organizations. The disruption undermines staff morale. There's a sense in which the elder senior people who can afford to retire do so, and the ones who remain do so, but in a sense it changes their whole attitude towards their employer, their institution. And that's not good. That's not healthy. It doesn't make for better teaching. It doesn't make for a better student experience when you have rather cynical, demoralized academic staff who are just doing the job, but, their conditions of employment are getting worse all the time.
In some cases, what I've heard is that the students and staff actually form new bonds and have deeper solidarity through some of this restructuring that happens. But I don't think it happens everywhere. I've heard just a few stories about that. I guess, to end here, Cris, you've been in universities for a long time now. You've studied universities. You've seen them radically change over your lifetime. What would it look like today to sort of resist some of these changes? You brought up a few unions in Australia and in the UK. Is the union movement fit for purpose to try and resist some of this? Is there other forms of resistance that academics and students and even, parents and future parents might sort of begin thinking about? Like, how can we resist some of these changes to potentially not see the total collapse of the university as we know it?
I think unions are essential in this process because it's one of the very few organized forums where people can get together, and the individualizing and totalizing tendencies can be mitigated a bit through collective action. So we need our unions more than ever. But I think, this kind of contestation has to be fought on several fronts. Yes, parents and students themselves need to be a bit more proactive in contesting the narratives that are being thrust upon them, that, universities is all about gaining your qualifications to a well-paid job, and governments need to actually take stock of this, because actually the model that we're following is not working. It's not delivering a better student experience. I don't think it really is serving the economy better. Just because you're trying to disincentivize students from pursuing degrees in the arts and the humanities on the grounds that these have very little economic value, little value to the economy. I mean, this is a narrative being played out certainly in New Zealand, where they've just cut all funding to the Marsden Royal Society Marsden Fund that used to fund social science and humanities. They've just cancelled that completely on the spurious, ridiculous grounds that it doesn't contribute to economic prosperity. Yeah, so we need the government. I think we need to have a rethink and maybe commission a report on what is the purpose of higher education in terms of what kind of citizenry do we want, and also think about the reclaiming the space of higher education. Definitely the onslaught, the march of the conquest of universities by for-profit providers. In a sense, this is all about resource extraction, in the same way that, you see the big oil companies and mining companies extracting value from the land. This is the same process going on there. How do you resist that? By organized opposition to it and through legislation. we need to protect. And I think in some ways, we need to revalue our universities as a national treasure that is not simply something that should be subject to the logic of markets. I mean, just in the past, when universities were set up in the post-war period, many of the new universities, certainly in Europe, looking back at what had happened to universities in Nazi Germany or in fascist Italy, there was an attempt to put universities in a space that was at arm's length from government. And I think we need to rethink that. We don't want universities to simply be, the mouthpieces for the commercial interests or the mouthpieces of government. They need to be sovereign. They need to have this sort of independence, and they need to be protected and regarded as something rather special. But how we achieve that, well, that's a good question that we'll only find out in the arc of the next 10 to 20 years, I think.
Well, Cris Shore, thank you so much for joining FreshEd.
Thank you, Will.
Cris Shore is an emeritus professor of anthropology at Goldsmiths. He's recently published a book with Susan Wright called Audit Culture: How Indicators and Rankings Are Reshaping the World. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Ogunle, Phyllis Che-Metza, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast without advertisements, and is made possible by the support of the University of Canberra, NORAG, the Shakdev Family Fund, and listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brem, and I'll be back next week.